Hey, Jason,
Yes, Gary.
I hear you got a new headphone.
Yes, we're gonna try out a new one tonight and see if it keeps cutting out where.
Did it cut out on you?
I think that might have been operator error.
Well, that may be the problem with everything.
You did get the idiot-proof one, didn't you?
Oh, no.
Oh no!
I got the left-handed one.
Oh, you got the left-handed microphone. That's the problem. He buys left-handed stuff, and I can't use left-handed microphones.
Hey, Jason,
Yes, Gary.
been working on dovetails.
Have you been working on dovetails?
Yep. You just take your pocket knife real sharp and just start whittling on those things.
Yeah.
And when you get them all whittled in just right, then they just fit just like that.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Need to work on the depth a little bit.
Little overshot on the depth there. But
Yeah, it'll work.
sometimes they make them that way on purpose.
Then you sand it down after it's put together.
Well, you leave it like that to make it look a little more rustic.
That looks more artistic that way,
Yeah.
doesn't it?
You know, the Japanese master craftsmen always plan a mistake in their project anyway.
You know, the Navajo weavers do the same thing. And that's so that, I guess if you've done something perfect, then what are you going to do next?
You got nothing to strive for next time.
But as I was doing this, I was thinking about Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation.
Were you?
Yeah, because that's what happens with Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation, isn't it? They just kind of fit together like this.
They dovetail together.
They dovetail right
Nice
together.
segue.
And so
I like it.
it's one of those things when you put them all together, it fits, it works. And so I'm glad we're doing all these together, Ezekiel and Daniel and Revelation, because they just all fit together.
That was a great idea your coworker had.
It was, yeah. I remember him. He had a really good idea to do these things.
Well, that's early in the year to have a good idea.
The one that you had.
The one good idea for the year. And
what are we going to do tonight?
we are going to hopefully finish the book of Daniel, I believe.
I think we might.
Although chapter 11 is pretty long.
Yeah, I know it. Did you see how long you got? Like 3 verses, and I got like 100.
I got 13.
Yeah, but I had
You got
40 something, 45 verses.
Yeah.
I had 45, and you got 3.
I think it's commensurate with our experience.
I don't
level.
think so. Especially after tonight, you won't think so.
Uh-oh.
Now, you remember last week we said that chapter 9 was probably the most difficult chapter in Daniel, just that the prophecy was most difficult.
It's just the most difficult one we've gotten to.
Well, it's the most difficult, but I think chapter 11 is the most confusing.
Okay.
There's a difference between being difficult and confusing, and I think chapter 11 is just flat out confusing.
Okay.
And I'm not going to go into all the details. Jim McGuigan's done a real good job of writing a paraphrase where he adds the names and the places and everything in there, and that's right over there. If you want to read that to us from verse 2.
From verse 2?
Yeah.
All the way?
No, I'll just read the first 2, and we'll see why
Okay,
I'm not
verse
going
2.
to use this.
And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet, in addition to Cyrus, in whose reign the vision is received, Cambyses, Darius the first Hystaspes, and Xerxes, who shall be richer than they all, and he shall use these riches, see Esther 1, verses 3 to 4, to stir up opposition against Greece.
Thank you. And the rest of it reads like that. If God would have put that in there, people would have not followed it, I don't think. And so he wrote it in a simpler way that still accomplishes its purpose. This is chapter 11 is a very, very historically correct, detailed account of what's going to happen. And God demonstrates that he knows exactly what's going to happen, and he's in charge of what's going to happen.
It's almost easy to understand why people want to date this book, 400 years later than it was actually written, because it is so accurate and it is so detailed in the way it portrays the history that has yet to happen, that people look at it and think, well, there's no way it could have been written beforehand.
How could Daniel have known all of these historical events that were going to happen? They're precise, and so it must have been written much later than these things happened. Either that or God inspired it.
Either that or miracles can happen, and some people can't bear the thought of that, so they have to date it later.
They have to. That's the only way to get around it, because they can't argue with the history.
Right.
But instead of God using those names, he talks primarily about the king of the north and the king of the south, and that those people are going to change. The names are going to change, But it's much easier to read about the king of the north and the king of the south than to get all of those names in there. And McGuigan jumps over a whole bunch of minor people, and there's still jillions of names in there that mean nothing to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's written in a way that it's still confusing because there's so many details. But I think it was written the best possible way, of course, to get the message across that God knows what's going to happen, and He's in control, but in a way that's not just totally confusing for us. And so we begin chapter 11 in the first 4 verses. It says, "In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him." And the first question arises, who's the I?
Well, we want to assume it's Daniel because it's got his name on the book, but we have to go back probably to a previous chapter and look and see who was speaking.
That would probably be really good advice.
Yeah.
To see who's still speaking from the previous chapter. And you had the previous chapter, so who was speaking at the end of the last chapter?
Was it the man in linen? The man dressed in linen?
Yeah. And so whoever is speaking at the end of that chapter is speaking now. This angelic being or heavenly being is speaking. And so
the one who had come in response to Daniel's prayer that was delayed for 3 weeks because of the battle that was going on.
Yeah. And it was it Gabriel that was
we want to associate it with Gabriel. I don't think he's named. Is he named Gabriel in that chapter?
I don't remember if they name him.
I don't think
specifically.
Michael was the one that
he mentions Michael as being the warrior, the one that's fighting. But anyway, this one.
Gabriel does bring an answer. Yep, it is Gabriel.
Is it Gabriel? Okay.
It is Gabriel.
And so this is Gabriel speaking. So in the first year of Darius the Mede, Gabriel arose to be an encouragement and protection for him. And you pointed out last week how these things are going on behind the scenes in spiritual realms. And that's all he's saying, that he arose to be an encouragement and a protection to Darius. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then the 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. Pretty specific about who's going to be involved here. And you want to remember that the chapter begins with Persia. And it's going to end with Rome. So we're going to go all the way through the Persian Empire and the Roman or the Greek Empire and into Rome by the end of the chapter. A mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded. For his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. There are going to be 3 more kings in Persia after this. Then a 4th king is going to arise, and he's going to gather the whole empire against Greece. And that's Xerxes. And we know him from the book of Esther as Ahasuerus. The Persians and the Greeks were just arch enemies. And I think his father had been defeated at Marathon. Xerxes ran into a couple of problems at Thermopylae, and then a naval battle at Salamis. And he just had to go back home because he was beat. And so he thought that he had a huge army, and he thought that he was going to win, but he just couldn't beat Greece. And so, although he gathered his whole empire against them, some accounts have 1 million soldiers landing north of Thermopylae and coming down that way. But he lost. And then a mighty king will arise, and that's Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great never lost a battle. He swept his way all across clear to India, and he was conquering the whole world. He's recognized as maybe the greatest military leader in all of history. And then he died. And so, age of 33, I think, 32 or 33. And you've probably seen that poem that compares Alexander and Jesus. They both died at the same age. And what Alexander accomplished, but you look at what Jesus accomplished. Jesus wins that comparison. And his kingdom was broken up into 4 parts. It didn't go to his descendants, and it didn't go according to his authority. There are tales about his deathbed statement of when they said, "Who do you want to take your place?" And one version is the strongest. The other version is that he named somebody, but probably he didn't say anything. And so he did not give authority to who's going to replace him. And there'd be basically four kingdoms that would arise out of his. The Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Mesopotamia and Central Asia, and then a couple more minor ones, the Alatids in Turkey, Anatolia, and then another kingdom in Macedonia. But the only two that really matter are the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And they're the ones who are going to be duking it out on the rest of the chapter. And whenever it's talking about the king of the north, it's talking about the Seleucids. They're the ones up toward Mesopotamia and Central Asia. When it talks about the king of the south, it's talking about one of the Ptolemies. And there were a bunch of them, and there are a bunch of Seleucids, and we don't have to worry which ones are which. The first, from verses 5 to 10, it says, "The king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion indeed. And after some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. But she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up, along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in those times. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come up against their army and enter the fortresses of the king of the north, and she will deal with them and display great strength. And also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity into Egypt, and he on his part will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. Then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. And his sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortresses." And again, I don't think the details of who these are matter as much as the fact that God is aware of all these things. And I think the main message we get out of this is that it's all done by deception and intrigue. Everybody was calculating against everybody else and stabbing each other in the back, and they were making alliances and breaking alliances. And
it's like a soap opera.
It's like a soap opera. This period from 323 or whenever it was, and Alexander the Great died, on up to the coming of Jesus, is really that period between the Testaments. It's after the time of the writing of the last books of the Old Testament, before the New Testament. And these are just a whole bunch of really strange things that are taking place during that time. That the king of the south, there'll be an alliance. The daughter of the king of the south will make a peaceful arrangement with the king of the north. One of her descendants will enter the fortress of the king of the north, but they will take their idols to Egypt, to the south, and the sons of the king of the north will wage war on the fortress. So as I say, it's just, you can get one of these sheets and go through the details of that if you want to, but the point is that there's just a whole lot of intrigue going on, and God's aware of it. Verses 11 through 13. "And the king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. When the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. For the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years he will press on with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down." So the king of the south is going to be enraged and go forth and going to fight the king of the north. The multitude of the latter, the north, will be given to the former, the south, and many will rise up against the king of the south. Then it continues with verse 14. "Then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege mound, and capture a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land, with destruction in his hand. And he will set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many. But a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn, for he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and be found no more." That well-fortified city was Sidon. The general of one of the kingdoms was holed up in Sidon, and that city was attacked. The king of the north prevailed, but he would eventually stumble and fall and be found no more. From verse 20, it says, Then in his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom, yet within a few days he will be shattered, though neither in anger nor in battle. And in his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. And the overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. And after an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. And he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war. But he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. And those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. And so again, it's all by intrigue and deception. They make promises, they make treaties, they break them. They speak lies to each other, sitting down at the same table, and they're lying to each other. But what's going to happen is only going to happen because God has determined it, and in the end it hasn't come yet. And so there's just basically chaos. And so there is an oppressor through the jewel of the kingdom. It's going to be shattered within a few days. We can identify the despicable person as Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was indeed very despicable and not a good person at all. In time of tranquility, he will accomplish what others never did, but it will only last a little time. He stirred up his strength against the king of the south, but his own associates destroyed him. Both the kings, north and south, speak lies to each other at the same table. They won't succeed, but the end is still to come at the appointed time when God has determined. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. At the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will be disheartened, and return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. And forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. And by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. And those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now we're getting closer to Israel, things that are going to be closer to home, because now they're turning their desperation toward Jerusalem and toward Israel. If they can't be successful where they're fighting each other, and then they're going to turn on these other lands. And this one's heart is set against the Holy Covenant. And this last time is not going to turn out the way it did before, because the ships of Cyprus are against him. Historically, there was a ship from Cyprus that carried some people from Rome, from the government of Rome. They came basically and told him to drop it. And so he had to go back home and take his wrath out on the Jews. He will show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. If people don't want to follow God, he likes them, but he does not like the ones that follow the covenant. And there will be a desecration and the abomination of desolation. And that's when he offered pig's blood on the altar in Jerusalem. And they couldn't use it anymore because it had been totally desecrated by the offering of pig's blood. He will use his smooth words, but the people who know God will display strength and take action. And yet he will fall, and his fall will be pretty extensive. We're still in the ones that followed when the Greek Empire fractured into those four. We're still in that period of toward the end of their empire, and so the Ptolemies and the Seleucids are the ones we're talking about, and they're just going back and forth. But we're getting ready to switch to the Romans, at least in some commentaries. Other commentaries say it's still talking about the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. McGuigan gives a pretty persuasive argument that it switches to the Romans. But there's another commentary that gives a pretty persuasive reasoning that it doesn't switch to the Romans. And so, but right to this point, we're still talking about the remnants of the Greek Empire. We might call it a Hellenistic empire because the one thing that Alexander accomplished of a lasting measure was he Hellenized the world. That's when the world became Greekified, and the Greek language, and that's why the Koine Greek was the universal language when Jesus came. In art and literature and in culture, that part of the world became Greek, and so that's what's happening during this period in a cultural way. Now, when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. And some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. And notice how we're still talking about an appointed time and an end time that God knows ahead of time, and He's telling Daniel ahead of time what's going to happen. Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished. For that which is decreed will be done. And he will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all, but instead he will honor a god of fortresses, a god whom his father did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. And he will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and he will cause them to rule over the many, and will parcel out land for a prize. In verse 36 is where that king of the north becomes Rome instead of the Seleucids. And so this is where that switches, Chuck, along about verse 36. He's granted a little bit of help. Many will join in his hypocrisy. Some with insight will fall in order to purge and refine and make pure. It's still to come at the appointed time, but he exalts and magnifies himself. The early Roman emperors weren't real pushy about being gods. A few of them claimed deity, but it would be Domitian after Titus who would demand it. But little by little, they're gaining that idea. And then the verses 40 through 45. At the end of time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, with many ships. And he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. He will also enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall. But these will be rescued out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. Then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. But he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. And Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. But rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him. He will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate the many. And he will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Now we're getting toward the end of time, because this is that last empire that was in that original dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And the king of the south will collide with him. And now we get into some names you recognize. Cleopatra was basically the ruler of the south then, and she made an alliance with Mark Antony. Egypt was the only area that Rome didn't have total control over. And Cleopatra and Mark Antony were going to lead a rebellion against Rome, and they were going to take over the world. It didn't work, and they both committed suicide.
Was Cleopatra a descendant of that Ptolemaic?
She was in that same family, the Ptolemies.
Family of the Ptolemies.
There were at least two, maybe more Cleopatras in that line, and so if you're running the word Cleopatra, it may or may not be her, but this is the one we think of. And Mark Antony was a former ally of Octavian, Augustus Caesar, but then he rebelled against him. And so they're fighting against the first Caesar, Augustus. The king of the north, who's now Rome, will enter the beautiful land, and I wonder what the beautiful land would be.
Beulah land.
Beulah land, okay. So Beulah land, sweet Beulah land. Well, what's Beulah land? The beautiful land.
The promised land.
The promised land. The land that we know of as Israel. Edom, Moab, and Ammon were rescued. For some reason, I think the Romans got sidetracked or something happened, and they didn't defeat them. And so historically, that's what happened. Stretch out his hand against other countries. Rumors from the east and north will disturb him. The Romans were always plagued with things that were happening to the north with the Celts and other tribes that were always threatening them. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. So there you go through that confusing chapter. If you're going to get anything out of that chapter, what would you hope to get out of that chapter?
Well, it strikes me that out of the chaos, God is able still to work out His plan that brings about the kingdom that He has promised from the beginning of the book of Daniel, the kingdom that has no end. Because this is a time of chaos, of changing of world empires on a scale that is just mind-boggling. The sizes of the armies and the effects of the battles and the cultures that just shift from one to the other. And how does any stability come out of that? Only by God's plan is how stability comes out of that. And I think that's why it happens this way, to demonstrate His sovereignty.
And I think you're right. That's probably the reason for this description. In addition to the fact that it shows that He knows what's going to happen. But I think the main point is to show that He's in control. And out of the chaos comes what we know of as the kingdom, the church. And so He's setting that stage. But, as I say, I think it's written the best possible way without getting into names and battles and places and everything. Just it's going on between the king of the north and the king of the south, and they're lying to each other and cheating each other, and a lot of intrigue. Yeah. But the point is, as you say, that out of chaos comes order. The last verse, which is the holy mountain is Jerusalem, and even though he conquers Jerusalem, he's still going to meet his end. Not necessarily at the same time, I don't think. No, that of the emperor. I don't think it's Rome in general. I think it's the emperor that they exalt themselves. They make themselves up to be God. I think it's talking about a specific, an individual. Yeah. No.
Would this be in line with the destruction of Jerusalem, which was Titus, who led the army against Jerusalem? But when Titus launched that campaign, he was not yet emperor. No. Vespasian was emperor, and Vespasian died while Titus was on that conquest. Titus finished up the conquest of Jerusalem, tore down the temple, destroyed everything, and then when he went back to Rome to become emperor. So he was poised to continue his military campaign against Moab and Edom and Ammon and those other places, but Vespasian died and he became emperor, so he left and went back to Rome.
And then after him, then you get Domitian. He's the first one that demanded to be considered a god. I read something interesting today about some of the other emperors didn't have time to even worry about it, but one said that Nero was too egotistical to give credit to anybody but himself. So he didn't even want to give credit to a god. He was just so great because he was just the greatest there ever was.
Too egotistical to call himself a god.
Yeah.
That's an indictment. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
All right. So that leads us into the conclusion then. Daniel chapter 12 is going to wrap everything up with a nice, neat little bow.
It'll all make sense.
It'll answer all the questions. There'll be no questions. I'm sure nobody will have any questions like Chuck did at the end of this chapter to throw at me the way, and I hope. No.
And we do have a couple, I did print run up a couple of copies of Jim's paraphrase.
Okay. I've still got questions at the end of chapter 12.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so.
Oh, man.
All right, chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. Now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress, such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. And those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. Michael stands guard over the people. And the time of distress is during this time of distress. And there's three possible times that commentators try to put into this description of what it is. It could be under that reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, and he did horrible things. He desecrated the temple. He desecrated the sacrifice. Actually stopped for a period of time because the temple had been desecrated and they couldn't use the altar. It could be at AD 70 at the destruction of the temple, which I think would be my placement of where this goes, because it fits in that timeline of things that we've just been talking about with the shift from talking about the Greek Hellenistic kingdom into the Roman kingdom there towards the end of chapter 11. Some people try to put it at the destruction of the world, at the end of actual time, but there's some reasons that it's not that to put it bluntly.
There's a reason, there are only two choices.
Yeah, so really, from the standpoint of being faithful, I believe what the biblical text is talking about. I think you could make a case that there possibly is some reference to Antiochus here, and some people hold out the possibility that it's a reference to both, because there are some parallels between the things that happen under Antiochus versus the things that happen under Rome. But to put a suspension of time from the prophecies that are also specific, and we've got all of these things unfolding, and even though, you know, we have to go back and kind of put names to it after the fact, but it fits with all of the history that takes place. And then all of a sudden, for the last 10 or 12 verses of the book, we're going to just chop that off, and then we're going to jump ahead however many thousands of years it's going to be, because we still don't know when the destruction of the world will be, but we're just going to have a suspension of anything that prophetically happens until all of a sudden we're at the end of time. It doesn't fit, plus there's no need for it. There's no need to interpret it as being a reference to the end of time in order to be faithful to the text. So I really think, like Gary said, there are only two possible scenarios that are being addressed here. And when he says specifically there at the beginning, the introduction of verse 1, and remember, this is all written without verse and chapter breaks. Chapters 10, 11, 12 are all one prophecy. And so now at that time is a direct reference to the things that has just been addressed, and it refers to the events that were just being talked about in chapter 11. So to try to then jump from those events all the way thousands of years forward is troublesome. So now at that time refers to the events of chapter 11. The focus of the message is on your people. Daniel would understand that he is talking about people that are a part of his kingdom, not the future kingdom that we've been hearing about through the prophecies that is going to be established by God at a future date. But these are Daniel's people. These are his tribesmen. And so the focus of this message is on what will happen to your people. And it's interesting that a couple of times throughout this prophecy, we have the idea of those names that are written in the book. Did the Jews do much of writing people's names in books? Was that something they valued?
I think so.
If you've been reading through the readings that we've been doing, have you come to some sections where there have been a bunch of list of names, and those names don't mean anything to you? They meant something to the people that wrote them. The Jews were all about writing down their ancestry. They knew their lineage. They knew what it meant to be added to that book. They knew what it meant to be a part of the nation, because they were included in that book. And so this symbolism here of God having a book that has the names of the faithful written in it would have been a very powerful image for them. And
your identity as a Jew depended on you being able to prove your lineage.
Yeah, if
you had to prove your ancestry.
If you couldn't prove your lineage, you couldn't. I mean, for Levites and for Levites especially, they couldn't serve as priests or as work in the temple if they could not establish their identity as a descendant of Levi, as a descendant of Aaron, to be a priest. And so when we have them returning, like in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and you have those genealogies of people, and they're going back with those lists of names, that was very, very important to them. And so here Daniel using, or the angel using with Daniel, this terminology or the symbolism of having names written in a book, that's a very powerful image for them.
If I understand correctly, even after their return to Israel in recent history, anybody had a right to a house, to be given a house, but you had to prove your Jewish ancestry.
Okay.
And it had to be proved through your mother, because you can't prove who your father is, but you can prove who your mother is.
Okay.
And so supposedly, if I understand correctly, that the people who returned to Israel in the last 50 years, 60 years or so, were due a house if you could prove your Jewish ancestry through your mother's line,
Okay.
her mother and her mother and her mother. And so it's still important to them.
Yeah.
Still today, it's critical to be written in the book.
Right. And so, I mean, just that imagery is so powerful there in Daniel. Daniel was told there to conceal and seal. And that idea of concealing is not what you think of with concealing. It's not hiding it. It is protecting it. It is, it's keeping it safe. And so Daniel was not told to hide this message and not tell anybody about it. He was told to protect the message. He was told to secure it so that it could be held for posterity. So that as these events unfolded, people would be able to understand this is all going according to God's plan.
Can we give just a little vignette of a preview here?
Certainly.
Now, he's told to conceal and seal these things because they're going to be happening a long time in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking a few hundred years here. We get to Revelation, and John is told things that are shortly to come to pass. So how do you make shortly come to pass mean thousands of years if a few hundred years is, it doesn't, this shortly is shortly, and when Revelation is even shorter, it's not talking about the end of the world, it's talking about things that are coming soon.
And in Revelation, we have much more imagery of breaking the seals and opening things up rather than the idea of locking them down and preserving them by sealing them. So
but there's still a key element in Revelation about being in the book. There are lots of books in Revelation, and so just so you'll be ready for in a couple of weeks when we start that book, you want to be sure that you're ready to go.
All right, so verses 5 through 7. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the river, the other on that bank of the river. One said to the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long will it be until the end of these wonders? I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and a half time, and as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. So this is the conclusion of the vision. And remember, the vision started at the beginning of chapter 10. We have Daniel there seeing that man dressed in linen. He's on the banks of the Tigris River. And now we see this man dressed in linen still there. He still is part of this vision, but there's one man on the other side of the bank. There's one man on the same side as Daniel, and they're echoing back and forth. They're calling things out to one another. The man dressed in linen is that, and that a minute ago I said it was Gabriel. Gabriel's at the end of chapter 9. The one in chapter 10 is not named. Okay. Many speculate that it is Gabriel, because Gabriel is kind of the one that always brings important messages when he is identified. It's often Gabriel that's identified as the important messenger that God sends. But this man dressed in linen is never identified by name. But then there is this angel on each bank of the Tigris River, and they ask the question, how long? And the answer is given in the form of an oath. And the oath, by invoking the name of God, the angel is putting God's seal of approval on the message that he has delivered. So this vision, this prophecy is ending after all of the stuff that we've seen in chapters 10, 11, and 12. The angel is putting God's seal of approval on the entire message. Angels, first of all, only speak what God tells them to speak. An angel would never, an angel specifically is a messenger of God. They're an ambassador for God. So they can't speak in the first place without bringing that authority. But then to invoke God's name specifically what would happen to an angel who invoked God's name in a way that wasn't proper?
Not good.
Not good. That man dressed in linen would not have fared well had he invoked God's name at that point, and then God said, "I didn't give you that message. That's not my message that you were supposed to take." So that's an indication of the veracity, the truthfulness of the message. And his answer to the question, "How long?" goes back to, I'm going to let you take it because you had that chapter a couple weeks ago. Time,
and a half of times, which is 3.5, which is half of a 7, which is a limited time.
A limited time.
7, if 7 is a complete time, then a broken 7 is a time times and half a time.
Okay. So how long is it going to be?
About that long.
About that long.
Not real long. I mean, it's going to be a while, but it's not going to be forever.
And as we've said, or at least I said a couple weeks ago, the temptation, the desire, the yearning for us as we read through prophecies like this, and we're able to put some specific dates, some specific people into these prophecies and see how they fit in. The yearning then is to make everything in that prophecy have a specific meaning and a specific fulfillment. But that's not the nature of this type of prophecy. This type of prophecy is highly symbolic by nature. And if we try to take those things that are specifically given as symbols and try to force them into a specific meaning when that's not what was intended, we come up with terrible misuses of the text and terrible misinterpretations of what the text actually means. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I understand the yearning. I understand the desire. I'd love to know. I mean, my question is the same. How long? How long, God? And I mean, when we read the book of Revelation and we talk about some things that pertain to the end, I want to know how long. But God didn't tell us how long, and so we have to accept that. You know, the secret things belong to God, and trying to force a fulfillment or an interpretation into the Scripture that wasn't intended is dangerous. And so, how long? I don't know, but it's represented by a symbolic period of time that means it's not going to be forever, because if it was forever, it would be the complete time. But it's going to be a specified time that God knows, and when it's ready to end, God will make sure it ends.
And also, if we get locked into a certain paradigm, way of looking at things, we miss what's really there. Mm-hmm. We miss the important messages that are there because we're so focused on applying everything to fit our theory, and we miss God's message. That's a shame. Right.
Yeah. Daniel 12, verses 8 through 10. Yes, sir.
We're talking about how long, and it says the time, times, and half a time, and as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, will be completed.
Okay.
Who they? They're talking about, and the holy people.
Yeah, for me, the simplest application of that would be, for the holy people would be the nation of Israel, and the power of the holy people was the temple. And so the destruction of the temple in AD 70 was the shattering of the power of the holy people. What happened to the nation of Israel after AD 70? I mean, where was that nation? Where was their religious center? Where was their center of worship after that? There still isn't one.
No, and 2,000 years later, they've never gotten back to that. They're still without a temple.
Yeah. So, so that, I mean, to me, that fits. That makes the most sense to me. I think other people again would look at this and maybe try to make some application of it to Antiochus Epiphanes, and there's some parallels there, but then there's stuff that happens after that I think has already been addressed. So I think to me this fits better with the destruction of the temple at AD 70. Okay, verses 8 through 10. As for me, I heard but could not understand. So I said, my Lord, what will be the outcome of these events? And he said, go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end of time. Many will be purged, purified, and refined, but the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand, but those who have insight will understand. Daniel's question is my question. I don't understand. I mean, Daniel had seen all these things. He had heard firsthand the explanations that were given from the angels. He was there for it. He was living in the midst of it, and still he had questions that he couldn't grasp the answer to. And the angels' words there, go your way, Daniel. Accept it. You're not going to know everything. You're not going to be able to know every detail of what God has delivered here. But these words are going to be revealed as they are sealed and concealed until the end of time. And remember, end of time, there's this push, this effort that many have to make that the end of time as in the destruction of the world. But that's not what that phrase means in Daniel. That phrase in Daniel means at the end of this period of prophecy. The end of the period of time that this prophecy pertains to is what the end of time means here. It doesn't mean the end of the earth. It means, I think, until AD 70. That's when this prophecy is completed. Many will be purged and purified and refined. There was a weeding out, if you will, of people who were not serious about their faith. Many abandoned the faith, both under Antiochus and under the Roman influence. Many of those Jews were Hellenized under that influence, and they lost their way. They lost their faith. But many were faithful and remained faithful even in the face of terrible persecution. But then it says, those who have insight will understand. In AD 66, when Titus led that army into Jerusalem, or to the hills surrounding Jerusalem, and he began the siege of Jerusalem, Christians who were in tune with what the book of Daniel said fled Jerusalem. Jewish people stayed in Jerusalem because that's what they had to defend. They had to stay there and protect the temple. Christians abandoned Jerusalem and they left. So they had the insight. Jesus, in his description of when the disciples in Matthew chapter 24 asked Jesus, I believe in Matthew 24, the disciples think they're asking one question when they're actually asking two. They asked Jesus, what is the sign of the destruction of the temple, and what is the sign of the end of the world? They can't imagine that the temple would be destroyed by anything other than the destruction of the world. So they think they're asking one question when they're asking two. Jesus answers it as though it's two questions, because Jesus understands the destruction of the temple comes in AD 70, but the destruction of the world comes later on. And so Jesus, in his response to them, when he's talking about the destruction of the temple, quotes some of the verses that we've talked about from this prophecy in Daniel chapters 10 through 12, where he talks about the desolation of desecration. I said that backwards. Desecration of desolation, and those kind of things. So Jesus warned the people that when you see this coming, when you see the army gathering at the gates, it's time to leave. And people who heard the words of Jesus and understood them to pertain to the coming destruction of Jerusalem left. There weren't many Christians that died in Jerusalem in AD 70, but there were a lot of Jews that died. Okay. The chapter ends, the book ends, verses 11 to 13. And from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. But as for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. A final riddle, as if we weren't confused enough. It's bad enough he brings in 1,290 days, because I don't know what that number means, but then he says, those that make it past that and then actually attain to 1,335 days, an extra 45 days, you're in good shape. You're look at that, divided by 365, 3.5 years.
Yeah.
It's time and a half times.
Yeah,
It's 3.5
12.9.
years.
I thought it was 390 is
Yeah.
time and half a times. What the extra 45 days are worth, I'm not sure.
And I, this is one of those things where it seems like if we all of a sudden take a jump back in time, and now we're talking about the desecration of the temple at the time of Antiochus, when there was a restoration of the sacrifice, and for about 3.5 years under Antiochus, the sacrifice stopped. But then once they reclaimed the Temple Mount, once Judas Maccabeus led the revolt and they reclaimed the Temple Mount, they couldn't instantly start sacrificing again that day. They had to cleanse the temple. And it took them about 45 days to cleanse the temple. It took them a period of time to get the altar rebuilt. They couldn't just cleanse that altar. They had to tear it down and rebuild it. They had to go through the days of purification and the days of sanctification to set up the return to that sacrificial system. So the 45 days, extra 45 days, makes sense if we jump back in time a couple hundred years. But everything up to that point seems to be with Rome. So I'm not sure what that means.
The extra 45 days may just be a month and a half,
Mm-hmm.
because you've gone 3.5 years and just another month and a half,
Yeah.
symbolically, and you've got it made.
Yeah, and it could be that, don't make it through the bulk of the bad stuff and give up at the end, because once you've made it through the bulk of the bad stuff, the end is near, and you can make it. You can be faithful to the end. So the Antiochus treatment of the Jews and Roman siege of Jerusalem both were horrendous, terrible events for the Jewish people, atrocities that you and I can only read about in books. We'll never really understand the depth of the deprivation and the depth of destruction that they went through. But then Daniel is comforted. But as for you, you're not going to endure these things. You're having to endure the revelation of this message. You're having to have all these questions, but Daniel, there's a reward waiting for you because of your faithfulness. And so Daniel is being comforted at the very end by his own faithfulness. Greg?
Two thoughts. I wish some people that try to make something out of Revelation that isn't there would be this right about going your way.
Mm-hmm.
But you may have mentioned this already, but doesn't Luke 21 verse 20 kind of confirm what you were saying a minute ago? Where Jesus says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you will know that desolation is near.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Luke.
So it's not just knowing the words of Daniel, but knowing the words of Jesus.
Right.
That warns the Christians.
And Luke 21 is a parallel of Matthew 24, where he's basically talking about, in response to the same question that the disciples have asked about regarding the destruction of the temple, because Jesus has foretold the destruction of the temple, and they have questions about that because they're good Jews. They can't imagine that the temple could be destroyed, and if it is destroyed, it's got to be the end of the world. And so they conflate those two ideas. They think both of those are going to happen at the same time. And Jesus answers them knowing that they're not going to happen both at the same time.
But he gets pretty blunt going on there. It says, then let those who are in the Judea flee to the mountains, let those who
Right.
get out, let those in the country not enter the city. So this is the time of fulfillment, of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. Right.
And that is directly related to the prophecies that Daniel foresaw. And in Matthew 24, he even uses some of the same phraseology. That's he talks about the in what verse? 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. Well, by the time they were standing in the holy place, it was too late to flee, because that means they had breached the walls and they were there. So the ones that had insight, as Daniel put it, they were already gone by then. So,
Do we have any questions for these folks?
you probably did come up with some. I forgot to send you any, didn't I?
Oh,
Sometimes
man.
I forget to
I was
include
gonna,
questions.
I thought maybe you came up with some of them.
No.
What kingdoms are dealt with in chapters 11 and 12? Starts with
T.
Persia, goes
Persia,
to the
Greece,
Greeks,
and
and
the
then
Romans.
to the Romans.
Good.
A good part of it's the splinters of the Greek Empire. Who are the kings of the north and the kings of the south? Who are the kings of the north?
Starts with an S.
The Seleucids.
Seleucids.
And the kings of the south would
Starts
be,
with a P, but sounds like a T.
yeah, like a pterodactyl.
The Ptolemies. Yeah.
What is the beautiful land? Sweet, beautiful land.
Israel.
Judah, the land.
Palestine.
It is the land of Palestine. The only thing is that's offensive to Jews because it comes from the word for Philistine, the land of the Philistines. And the Romans applied that name to that land as an insult to the Jews. And so it is the land of Palestine, but Jews don't like for us to call it that because.
Okay. I won't.
Okay, I probably will. I'll probably forget. What's the abomination of desolation that's so important that it's repeated even by Jesus?
Desecration of the Temple Mount, the altar, where
Blood,
the sacrifice
pig's
was
blood.
done.
You put pig's blood on the altar. That pretty much is an abomination. And what is the time of distress?
There's a lot of it.
There's a lot of it. Trying to understand Daniel's time of distress. There's going to be a lot of time that bad things are happening and a lot of conflict and chaos and so forth. What does it mean to abolish the regular sacrifice? It's the end of the Jewish system. The AD 70, they haven't recovered from it yet. They don't have a temple and they don't have an altar and they can't do the annual scapegoat or the atonement or any of those things, so they don't have anything to do it with. And so the regular sacrifice has been abolished for more than 2,000 years.
But they're wanting to restore it, right?
Yeah, if they find that heifer.
Yep. Perfect red heifer.
The perfect red heifer. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Next week, Lord willing, devotional, 1 Samuel. And in 2 weeks, invite your neighbors and your friends and your enemies. Your frenemies. And invite them to come as we begin to study the book. There's no better time to start than 2 weeks from now, or next week with a devotional. The best time to start. And then you'll be ready for the study of Romans. Thank you very much.